Diana Foster was 34. Living alone on the edge of a quiet Nevada town where the desert stretched farther than anything she could hold on to, and 3 months earlier, the military had come to her door and told her her husband didn't make it back from a mission. She didn't scream when she heard it. She didn't collapse either. She just stood there, gripping the edge of the table, while the words settled in like something permanent, something final, something that wasn't supposed to be questioned. They said it was a failed operation. They said no one survived. And for weeks, Diana tried to live like that was the truth. She stopped answering calls. She stopped checking messages. Nights became longer than they should have been, and mornings felt like something she had to force herself through. Everything in her house stayed exactly the same, except for one thing that would never come back. Then one afternoon, her phone rang. She almost didn't answer. But something about it felt different. The voice on the other end wasn't calm. It wasn't casual. It was tight, shaking, like someone who had just seen something they weren't supposed to see. "Diana, you need to come over. Right now." She asked what was going on. There was a pause. Then came the words that changed everything. "There's something you need to see. Before we go any further, tell me what time it is where you're watching from and which city you're in. I want to see how far this story has reached. And if stories like this pull you in, don't forget to leave a comment and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next." Earlier that same year, before everything shifted in ways she couldn't predict, Diana had already spent most of her life learning how to exist without being wanted. Growing up, she was never the one anyone defended, never the one anyone chose first, and over time she stopped expecting anything different. In her family, attention and approval were reserved for her older sister, while Diana was left to adjust, to stay quiet, to accept less without asking why. That pattern didn't change as she got older. It only became more obvious, more deliberate, until leaving was the only decision that made sense. She walked away without drama, without a final argument, just distance. 5 years passed like that, with no real contact, no attempts from either side to fix what had already been broken. By then, Diana had built something steady for herself, something that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. And that was when Caleb Foster came into her life. He wasn't loud or complicated. He listened. He stayed consistent, and he never treated her like she to earn her place. Their relationship moved forward, without the kind of tension Diana had grown used to, and for the first time, things felt balanced. They got married quietly, without involving her family, and settled into a routine that felt simple but solid. Caleb's work kept him away at times, but it was predictable, structured, and she trusted it. Then everything changed the day the notification came. It wasn't a phone call first. It was a visit. 2 uniformed officers standing at her door, speaking in controlled, careful sentences that felt rehearsed. They explained there had been an operation, that something had gone wrong, that communication had been lost before anyone could respond. The details were limited, but the conclusion was clear. Caleb had not made it back. Diana didn't interrupt them. She didn't ask questions right away either. She listened until they finished, until the explanations repeating itself in different forms. And then she stood there in silence. As they offered sympathy, she didn't know how to receive. When they left, the house didn't feel empty in the way people usually describe. It felt unchanged, almost intact, which made the absence harder to accept. Over the next few days, people reached out, some out of obligation, others out of genuine concern. But none of it reached her in a way that mattered. She handled what needed to be handled, responded when necessary, and ignored the rest. What stayed with her instead were the small inconsistencies she couldn't explain. The timeline didn't fully make sense. The information she was given felt incomplete, like something had been simplified before it reached her. Caleb had always been direct about his work, not detailed, but never vague either. And now everything about what happened sounded vague, too vague. She went over the conversation with the officers more than once, not because she expected to find answers, but because something in it didn't settle the way it should have. That was the part she didn't say out loud, not to anyone. Because once something like that is officially declared, questioning it feels like refusing reality. So she stayed quiet, held on to the version of events she had been given, and tried to move forward without pulling at the details that didn't quite fit. What she didn't realize yet was that those details weren't random. They were missing on purpose. Later that same afternoon, Diana drove across town without giving herself time to think about turning back. The address she had was one she hadn't visited in years. A place she had deliberately removed from her life, yet now it was the only place that might explain what she had just heard. When she pulled into the driveway, Erin Shaw was already outside, standing near the door, arms crossed tightly as if holding herself together. Diana stepped out of the car and walked toward her, noticing immediately that Erin wasn't acting the way she used to. There was no small talk, no hesitation, just a direct urgency that didn't match anything familiar. Erin didn't explain anything right away. Instead, she motioned for Diana to come inside, her movements quick, controlled, like she had already gone through the shock and moved into something more focused. Inside, the house felt unchanged, but Diana didn't look around long enough to take it in. Erin picked up her phone from the table and held it for a second before turning the screen toward her. There was no build-up, no warning. Just a single image. At first glance, it looked ordinary. A man sitting outside a low building somewhere unfamiliar, the background washed in pale light, nothing distinct enough to identify the exact location. But the longer Diana looked, the less ordinary it became. The angle of the face, the posture, the way one shoulder leaned slightly forward. It was too specific to dismiss. She didn't react immediately. Instead, she leaned closer, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the details most people would overlook. There was a mark near the eyebrow, faint but visible, the same one she remembered from years earlier, the same one that had never fully faded. Erin watched her carefully. "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure you'd see it too," she said, her voice low but steady. Diana didn't answer right away. Her attention stayed on the screen, tracing every detail, comparing it against what she knew to be true and what she had been told to accept. The difference between those two things was starting to widen. "Where did you get this?" she asked finally, her voice quieter than expected. Erin explained that the image had come from a public post shared by someone she knew, connected to a small clinic near a remote area outside the state. It hadn't stood out at first, just another update about someone recovering after being found injured. But something about the face had caught her attention the second time she looked. Diana shifted her focus to the caption beneath the image. The description was brief, written in a neutral tone, mentioning that the man had been discovered after an operation months earlier and brought in by locals who found him alone. There were no names, no official confirmation, just enough information to raise questions. without answering any of them. Her grip tightened slightly around the phone. The timeline didn't match what she had been told. Not completely. There were gaps. Subtle, but impossible to ignore once they became visible. Erin reached over and zoomed in further, pointing to a detail Diana hadn't noticed at first: a bandage near the shoulder, positioned in a way that suggested an injury that had been treated more than once. Not recent, but not fully healed either. That's not from one incident, Erin said. That's from something that lasted longer than what they reported. Diana exhaled slowly, her thoughts starting to shift from disbelief into something sharper, more structured. This wasn't about hope, it was about inconsistency. And inconsistency meant something had been left out. She handed the phone back without looking away from the image. "Did you contact them?" Erin nodded. She had already sent a message earlier that day, asking for more information. But there hadn't been a response yet. Diana didn't hesitate after that. She took the phone again, typed out a second message with more direct language, identifying herself, stating clearly who Caleb Foster was to her, and asking for confirmation that couldn't be misinterpreted. When she finished, she sent it without rereading. Then, she set the phone down on the table and stepped back, creating distance, as if that would make the waiting easier. The room stayed quiet, but it wasn't the same kind of silence she had lived with over the past months. This one was active, filled with something unresolved, something that refused to stay buried. And for the first time, since everything had been declared over, Diana wasn't trying to accept what happened. She was starting to question it. That night stretched longer than either of them expected. Not because of what was said, but because of everything that wasn't. Diana stayed at the table while Erin moved around the house, checking her phone more often than she admitted to, each time hoping for a response that didn't come quickly enough. The message Diana had sent remained unanswered for nearly an hour, and the silence began to feel deliberate rather than accidental. When the reply finally appeared, it didn't arrive with urgency. It was brief, structured, and careful in a way that suggested whoever wrote it had chosen each word with intention. Erin opened it immediately, reading it once before handing the phone to Diana without adding anything of her own. The message confirmed that the man in the image had been brought into their care after being found injured near a restricted area connected to a military operation. It stated that he had been stabilized over time, that his condition had improved, and that he was currently under informal supervision rather than official custody. There was no mention of identification, no direct confirmation of his name, only a neutral description that avoided specifics. Diana read it twice, then a third time, focusing not on what was included, but on what had been omitted. There was no explanation of how someone connected to an operation could remain unaccounted for. No indication of why no official report had updated his status. The absence of those details carried more weight than the information provided. "Ask them directly," Erin said, her voice steady but firm. "Don't let them stay vague." Diana nodded, already typing before Erin finished speaking. This time her message was more direct, more precise. She didn't ask general questions. She stated clearly that Caleb Foster was her husband, that he had been officially declared dead, and that she needed confirmation that could not be misinterpreted or delayed. The response came faster than before. Not immediate, but quicker, as if the tone of her message had changed the way it was being handled. When it appeared, both of them leaned in slightly, neither speaking while Erin opened it. Yes. The message began without hesitation. The individual you are referring to matches the identity you have provided. Diana's posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Her shoulders straightened, her focus sharpened, and what uncertainty yet remained began to narrow into something more defined. The message continued, explaining that the man had been found alone, already injured, with no identification on him at the time. He had not been able to provide consistent information during the early stages of recovery, and because of the location where he was discovered, local authorities had avoided immediate escalation until his condition stabilized. Diana read each line carefully, not rushing, not reacting outwardly, but absorbing the implications as they formed. The explanation created more structure than before, but it still left critical gaps. If he had been found alone, that contradicted the report she had received. If he had been alive long enough to recover, that meant the timeline given to her had never been accurate. She lowered the phone slowly, placing it on the table instead of holding on to it. The weight of what she had just read didn't translate into visible emotion, but it changed the way she stood, the way she processed what came next. "Where exactly is this place?" she asked. Erin turned the phone back toward herself, scrolling to the bottom of the message where the location had been included. It was a small facility outside a remote part of Nevada, far enough from major areas that it wouldn't attract attention, but close enough to remain accessible if someone knew where to look. Deanna memorized the name without repeating it. Then she reached for her bag, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving, with the kind of clarity that comes when a decision has already been made. "I'm going there," she said. Erin looked at her for a second, searching her expression for any sign of doubt, but there wasn't any. "Then, I'm coming with you," Erin replied. Deanna didn't argue. She didn't agree out loud either. She just picked up the phone again, checking the message one more time, confirming the details, and then setting everything into motion without waiting for anything else to fall into place. What had started as uncertainty was no longer something she could leave unresolved. By the time Diana and Erin reached the remote outskirts of Nevada, the landscape had shifted into something harsher, flatter, and more isolating than anything Diana had driven through before. The road stretched out in long, uninterrupted lines, with only occasional structures breaking the emptiness, and each mile seemed to reinforce how far removed this place was from anything official or visible. The clinic wasn't marked in a way that stood out. It sat low against the land, almost blending into the surroundings, with a small parking area that held only a few vehicles. Nothing about it suggested urgency or importance, which made the situation feel even more controlled, more intentional. Deanna stepped out of the car first, her movements steady but deliberate, while Erin followed a second later, glancing around as if expecting someone to stop them before they reached the door. No one did. Inside, the building was quiet. A single receptionist looked up as they entered, her expression neutral but aware. Deanna approached without hesitation and stated her purpose clearly, giving her name. Then, Caleb Foster's, watching closely for any reaction that might reveal more than the words themselves. The receptionist didn't ask unnecessary questions. She nodded once, as if she had been expecting this moment eventually, and gestured toward a hallway that led to the back of the building. "He's outside," she said, her tone even. Offering no additional explanation, Deanna didn't pause to process it. She moved immediately, her pace controlled, Erin close behind her. The hallway was short, ending at a door that opened into a narrow outdoor space bordered by a low fence. And that was where she saw him. Caleb was seated on a wooden bench, his posture slightly forward, one arm resting across his leg in a way that suggested recovery rather than weakness. He looked different, thinner, more reserved, but not in a way that aligned with the version of events Diana had been given. There was no sense of disorientation, no visible confusion, just a quiet stillness that didn't match someone who had been disconnected from everything he knew. Deanna stopped a few steps away, taking in the details without speaking. The distance between what she expected and what she saw created a tension she didn't immediately resolve. Caleb turned his head slowly, as if aware of movement rather than presence, and his eyes landed on her without recognition, without hesitation, just observation. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Diana took another step forward, closing the gap just enough to remove any doubt about who she was. "Caleb," she said, her voice controlled, not raised, not softened. He stood up, not abruptly, not slowly, just with measured intention, his gaze remaining steady as he looked at her more closely. There was no immediate reaction, no visible shift that suggested familiarity. "I'm sorry," he said after a brief pause, his tone calm but detached. "Should I know you?" The question didn't land as confusion, it landed as distance. Diana held his gaze without responding right away, not because she didn't have an answer, but because something in the way he asked it didn't align with the explanation she had prepared herself to accept. This wasn't disorientation. It was something more controlled, more contained. Before she could respond, another presence entered the space. A man stepped out from the side of the building, his posture alert, his attention fixed on Diana in a way that suggested awareness rather than surprise. He approached at a measured pace, stopping just short of where they stood. "You shouldn't be here without clearance," he said, his tone firm but not aggressive. Deanna shifted her attention toward him, studying his expression. Noting the way he positioned himself slightly between her and Caleb without making it obvious. "And you are?" she asked. He hesitated for half a second before answering. "Logan Pierce." The name settled into the moment with more weight than expected. Deanna looked back at Caleb, then at Logan, the connection between them forming without being explained. Whatever had happened here, it involved more than just survival. Later that evening, the tension that had been building finally reached a point where it couldn't stay contained within silence or controlled responses. Deanna remained standing where she was, her attention shifting between Caleb and Logan Pierce, reading the space between them more than their words. The distance, the positioning, the way Logan stayed slightly forward without stepping in completely. It wasn't accidental. Deanna didn't raise her voice when she spoke again. "Explain it," she said, her tone even, directed at Caleb, not Logan. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He looked at her with the same measured expression he had maintained since she arrived, but this time there was something else beneath it. Something that suggested recognition, not of her presence, but of the situation itself. Logan exhaled quietly, as if he had already decided how this would unfold. "You weren't supposed to find him like this," he said, shifting the focus without directly answering her demand. Diana didn't react to that. "I didn't ask you," she replied, her gaze never leaving Caleb. That was when Caleb finally spoke again, but not in the way she expected. "It wasn't supposed to reach you yet," he said, his voice low, controlled, and far too precise for someone who didn't understand what was happening. The words settled differently, than anything he had said before. Deanna took a step closer, reducing the space between them until there was no room left for misinterpretation. "You know exactly who I am," she said. Caleb didn't deny it. That silence confirmed more than any admission could have. Logan shifted slightly, no longer trying to stay out of it. "The report you got wasn't wrong," he said, choosing his words carefully. "It was incomplete." Diana turned toward him now, her focus sharp, waiting for him to continue without prompting. "The operation failed," Logan added, "but not in the way it was written. There were decisions made in the field that changed how everything played out." Diana didn't interrupt. She let him continue. "Communication broke down," Logan said, "and when it did, not everyone followed protocol. The phrasing was deliberate, but the meaning was clear enough." Deanna looked back at Caleb. "What did you do?" Caleb's jaw tightened slightly, the first visible crack in his composure. He didn't answer right away, but he didn't look away either. "There was a choice," he said finally, "and it didn't end the way it should have." Logan stepped in before Diana could respond. "He wasn't the only one out there," he said. "And when things went wrong, he made a call that prioritized getting out over staying with the rest of the team." The words landed without distortion, without exaggeration, just stated plainly. Diana processed it without reacting outwardly, but the shift in her expression was immediate, subtle, but irreversible. "They didn't all make it back," Logan continued. "And once that happened, everything else became about containment. Reports were adjusted. Details were minimized. It was easier to declare the situation closed than to reopen what actually happened." Diana's gaze returned to Caleb, searching his face for anything that contradicted what she was hearing. "There were ways to reach out," she said, her voice steady. "There were ways to let me know." Caleb didn't argue that. He didn't offer justification either. "I couldn't," he said, but the answer lacked conviction. Deanna held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked away, not because she was uncertain, but because the clarity had already settled in. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't memory loss. It was avoidance, controlled and deliberate. Everything she had been told, everything she had tried to accept, had been shaped to keep this version of events out of reach. And now that it was in front of her, there was nothing left to question. The next morning arrived without any sense of resolution, only a clarity that hadn't been there before. And Diana didn't need more time to decide what she was going to do. She stood near the edge of the parking area, the dry air settling around her, while Caleb remained several steps behind, not trying to close the distance that had formed between them. There was no argument waiting to happen, no final explanation being prepared, just a quiet understanding that whatever had connected them before no longer existed in the same form. Deanna turned to face him fully, her expression steady. Not hardened, not emotional, just certain. "You had time," she said, her voice even. "Not just to survive, not just to recover, but to choose what to do after that. And you chose not to come back." Caleb didn't interrupt. He didn't deny it either. "That wasn't confusion," she continued. "That wasn't memory. That was a decision." Logan Pierce remained off to the side, silent now, no longer inserting himself into the conversation, as if he understood that whatever was being said didn't involve him anymore. Caleb took a step forward, but stopped before getting too close. "It wasn't that simple," he said, though the words lacked the weight they should have carried. Deanna shook her head slightly. It is," she replied. "You made a call out there, and then you made another one after. Both times, You knew exactly what you were doing. The space between them stayed unchanged. I believed what I was told, she added, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. I accepted it because I thought there was nothing left to question. But this, she glanced briefly toward the building, then back at him. This isn't something I can ignore. Caleb looked at her as if searching for something that might still be there, but whatever he expected to find wasn't reflected back at him. I can fix this, he said, though it sounded less like certainty and more like an attempt to hold on to something already slipping away. Deanna didn't respond to that directly. Instead, he's into Gooman. She reached into her bag and pulled out the ring she had stopped wearing weeks earlier, holding it for a moment before placing it on the hood of the car between them. This isn't something that gets fixed, she said. The finality in her tone left no room for negotiation. Caleb's posture shifted slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition of what that meant. For the first time since she arrived, there was no controlled response, no measured distance, just the absence of anything that could change the outcome. Deanna stepped back, creating physical space to match what had already separated them. She didn't wait for another explanation, didn't ask for one either. There was nothing left that required clarification. Aaron moved toward the passenger side without speaking, understanding the decision without needing it to be repeated. Deanna opened the driver's door, then paused for a brief moment, not to reconsider, but to say what needed to be said without turning it into something larger than it was. You didn't lose me out there, she said, her voice calm. You lost me here. She got into the car without looking back again. The engine started. The sound breaking the stillness that had settled over the space, and as the car pulled away, Caleb remained where he was, no longer followed by anyone. No longer part of the direction Diana was moving in. The road stretched out ahead, clear and uninterrupted. And for the first time since everything began, Diana wasn't trying to hold on to something that no longer existed. Later, when she thought about it, she didn't see it as a single moment that changed everything. It was a series of choices, small and large, that built toward a point where the truth couldn't be reshaped or softened. What mattered wasn't just what happened during that operation, but what happened after, when there was still time to be honest, and that chance was ignored. She understood then that loss doesn't always come from absence. Sometimes it comes from knowing someone was there, fully capable of choosing differently, and deciding not to. And once that becomes clear, walking away isn't an act of anger. It's the only way to stop accepting something that was never real in the first place.